The Denver Broncos are set to interview Sean Payton for their vacant head coaching job this week. Is he the perfect fit for what the Broncos need as someone who's going to lead the ship? Plus, on top of that, Broncos ownership group sits in a very advantageous spot with all the resources that they have. Does that make Denver more appealing to potential candidates? And according to people around Sean Payton, he's expressed interest in working with a player like Russell Wilson. Are they a good fit together? We dive into that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day from the south stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host and good friend, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in and making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. We have you covered all year long because for the true fan, there is never in off-season. Sean Payton is set to be interviewed here by the Broncos this week on Tuesday in Los Angeles with a contingent led by George Paton, Greg Penner, Condoleezza Rice, Kerry Walton Penner as well. The Broncos will travel there. Not only will they interview Sean Payton, but they will also interview Raheem Morris. And I think a question has to be asked, Sarah, and this has been the talking point, I think, of Broncos Twitter all throughout the weekend. Is Sean Payton the best fit for the Broncos at this point in time for what they need from a team standpoint, from an offensive standpoint, and I think overall with the direction that you have, and you have unlimited resources at your disposal, according to the ownership group. What are the Broncos' plans here, in your opinion, with a guy like Sean Payton?
I think, Cody, it is a great fit, to be honest. I mean, the Broncos, what they need more than anything is the best possible coach, right? And I think Sean Payton, as you talk about, all these reports about the Broncos taking a big swing in this coaching cycle and trying to go for some of these bigger name candidates. It's not just about going for the biggest names, right? Both Jim Harbaugh, Cody, and Sean Payton, they're both in the top 25 all-time NFL win percentage among head coaches. So these are big swings in terms of guys that are very, very good at their job. And like we talked about before, Jim Harbaugh, 71% winning percentage as a head coach at the collegiate and NFL level. Obviously didn't spend near as much time in the NFL as Sean Payton did, but Sean Payton, 16 years on the job with the New Orleans Saints as a head coach, a 63.1 win percentage, which translates out to, in today's NFL, almost 11 wins, Cody, 10.7 plus, but we're going to go ahead and round that up because there is no such thing as 0.7 win. You're going to say 11-6 over a 17-game season on average over 16 years. I mean, that's insane. And that's the reason why people are talking about him as being it's going to require a first-round pick plus to go ahead and get Sean Payton. You kind of understand that when you boil this thing down. So I get it that people are scared off by the price tag, including a draft pick. Nobody cares about the $3 million buyout for Jim Harbaugh at Michigan because, well, that's not your money, right? So you don't care. It's no skin off your back. But the first-round pick, well, I want to have fun watching the NFL draft. I want to be able to trade down and accumulate picks. No. Cody, we need to set the record straight here, okay? The Broncos need the best head coach possible. To circle back to your initial question, they need the best possible head coach for this team because, look, you're in a championship window, right? You got Russell Wilson at the age of 34 this season, right? You need to be able to have a coach that can come in and bring this thing together. We saw how well Jerry Rosburg did doing that, even in just a short amount of time. The pieces are in place on this roster. I think that you could do a good enough job in free agency, and then whatever you have left in the draft after this trade, I think Sean Payton is arguably maybe the best candidate. And I'm on record as saying I like Jim Harbaugh as maybe my number one guy, Cody. But man, Sean Payton deserves to be up there in terms of, like, I think it was reported by Mike Klitz a couple weeks back. 1A, 1B, there really is no number one clear cut right now for the Broncos. These two guys are top flight coach candidates.
Well, and we'll see, too. Competition is everything, right? The Arizona Cardinals obviously have requested an interview with Sean Payton, but as we know right now, Denver is the only team he has an interview lined up with. So I think that is something interesting to consider. Now, on top of that, another thing I want to mention is competition, right? The Los Angeles Chargers, as we saw, and I think this is also a lesson we learned in Wild Card Weekend, and the Broncos season more specifically in 2022, this is a great example. Coaching matters almost more than anything when you have a team that's really pretty well assembled at this point with what Denver has there. We saw it. So AFC West division rival, the Los Angeles Chargers. As of the time that we're recording this show here, they obviously haven't made a move, but there's a lot of talk and there's a lot of steam around the Chargers moving on from Brandon Staley. Now, there's also some local beat reporters in Los Angeles that are saying the Spanos family doesn't do things like this. They don't have the ability to pay him what he wants, and they don't react like this. They're not knee-jerk like this situation. However, I do think Brandon Staley giving up a 27-0 lead to the Jaguars, a game they should have won with the lead that they had and forcing 5 turnovers against the Jaguars offense, that is something you can't let go by the wayside. Not to mention, we could also chalk up a very interesting coaching decision last week when they played the Denver Broncos. Why were you playing your starters in the first place? I mean, I was watching that game and I was like, they could have used Mike Williams in a situation like this. So the Chargers, with a really good superstar quarterback in a rookie window, and all of a sudden you lose in the playoffs like that, is Brandon Staley the guy? I mean, I think we all have our questions about that from the outside. Chargers fans and Chargers people are also thinking the same thing. So if the Chargers job does come open, the Broncos will have competition for the rights and the services of Sean Payton. So this is going to be a very, very interesting week for the Denver Broncos. On top of that, will a decision happen this week? Sayre, from what I understand, from what I told, the Broncos would like to maybe have a decision sometime next week. By next week, they want to have their new guy in place because they're going to round out, obviously, the Payton interview, Raheem Morris, and then there's the Dan Quinn interview set later on for this week. After that, they'll make their initial evaluations. They'll sit and they'll discuss, and then if necessary, they'll conduct second interviews. But if they believe that they've found their guy, they're going to make the offer, and then we'll see what happens from there. And you know what? The Broncos initially weren't going to have a first-round pick this year anyway, so if you have to give that up and, accept the reality, okay, you know what? All the picks are going to come back for Sean Payton in 2024. I think that will be ideally fine in the eyes of Broncos country if it leads to 11 wins in a season, as you were mentioning here, my friend. So I think that's something that is important to make note of on today's episode. Locked On Broncos will also talk about some other things, including why the Broncos ownership group sits at a very advantageous position right now in comparison to some of the other jobs that are open across the National Football League. Why is Denver appealing? You'll get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at Prize Picks, and Prize Picks is daily fantasy sports done right. With the Prize Picks app, you choose 2 to 5 players that you're focused on heading into the week, and these players, they'll have a projection that's set by Prize Picks, and you simply choose whether or not they will have more or less than their Prize Picks projection, which could allow you to win 10 times your money on any entry. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections that are available. So download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up to play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match today up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks is going to give you $100. If you deposit $50, Prize Picks is going to give you $50. Don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp Therapy Online, and unfortunately, life doesn't come with a user manual, so when it's not working for you, it's normal to feel stuck. Therapists are trained to help you figure out the cause of challenging emotions and learn productive coping skills, which makes therapy the closest thing to a guided tour of the complex engine called you. BetterHelp has connected over 3 million people with licensed therapists. It's convenient, secure, and accessible anywhere, 100% online. I've utilized BetterHelp in the past, and I tell you what, I filled out a form. It matched me to a therapist. My therapist and I hit it off really, really well. She was very beneficial for me. We worked on a lot of things. But if you run into the event where you don't mesh well with your therapist, you can change at any time. It doesn't cost anything to you, and they'll be able to set you up with somebody that you vibe with very well. And everyone deserves to feel their best. BetterHelp makes it easier to get started, and as the world's largest therapy service, they've matched millions of people with professionally licensed and vetted therapists available 100% online. All of the benefits of in-person therapy, plus it's more convenient, more accessible, and more affordable. Get unstuck with BetterHelp. Learn more and save 10% on your first month at BetterHelp.com/LockedOn. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOn. All right, Sayre, continue on today's episode of Locked On Broncos. We dive into the Broncos head coaching search, which is wrapping up this week with interviews set up for Sean Payton. This episode is really dedicated towards the idea that what if Sean Payton is the next head coach for the Denver Broncos? I think one thing we have to touch on is the dynamic between Sean Payton and the ownership group. And I think when we look in comparison across the NFL, I mean, Sayre, before the Walton Penner family ownership group was in place, you could say, okay, hey, the Broncos don't seem like as an appealing of a spot because they have no ownership. They have no real foundation set there. I think we've learned a lot about the Walton Penner family ownership group in their first year. And granted, they were learning on the fly by the seat of their pants on a lot of things. They've had to make some tough decisions. But what stands out to me, and it was when Sean Payton did the interview with Peter Schrager on Fox, he said something along the lines of, what he's looking for. It's not necessarily about who's the quarterback. It's about, okay, is the organization stable? Is there good ownership there? Sean Payton mentioned that specifically. And I think that when we can look at other teams in comparison, I think that Denver is actually probably the more advantageous spot for a guy like Sean Payton. Now, with the ownership group, I think they have the advantage of being in the position that they're in. And not to mention, as we've seen, they're willing to fork out whatever it takes financially if need be. They're doing things for former players. I mean, they flew a whole contingent of former Broncos players out to Ronnie Hillman's celebration of life and his funeral. That was obviously a great gesture by them. They've spent over $100,000 to send the Colorado School of Mines student fan base to go cheer on them in the national championship in Texas. This is an ownership group that money doesn't matter. And in my opinion, I think that is advantageous for a guy like Sean Payton. Heck, for any head coach, Denver is a place I'd actually want to go.
Definitely, Cody. I mean, you can't say it better, really. And I think that, to your point, I was listening to an interview that Sean Payton did recently with his own daughter, who happens to be in the sports betting, realm, I guess, of the media sect that we're in, football media. And he was talking to her, and she was asking him questions, just point blank questions that any other reporter would ask, and he was answering them candidly. And one of the things that he said, he repeated exactly the point that you just made. He repeated the fact that he really enjoyed working for the Benson family with the New Orleans Saints. And he mentioned the relationships that he had with them, the relationships that he developed through the years, just the way that they had each other's backs. It was something that he's pointed to as the owner-coach relationship. And as we know, Greg Penner, told us this, that the coach is going to report to the owner. So that's how things work anymore in the NFL. I think that some fans were maybe taken aback by that. But I was also listening to the NFL Network insiders, and they made a point that that's kind of how things work in the NFL these days, that the coach doesn't report to the GM, to the owner. It's the coach and the GM. They both report to the owner. So it's a very interesting dynamic, but it's one that I think, to your point, is going to make a huge difference in this. Sean Payton, the breadcrumbs, Cody, are all leading towards him being the favorite to win this job, right? I know that 9 News insider Mike Kliss recently predicted that he would be the head coach on, the Fan, or I suppose they have a different name now, but he predicted that he would be the next head coach. We've seen that, reports that the Broncos would be willing to pay upwards of $25 million for Sean Payton. We've seen the fact that you mentioned earlier that the Broncos are the only team that actually has an interview lined up. Like, we can talk about all these other, team fits and the leverage and this and that. The Broncos are the only team that has an actual interview set up with Sean Payton. These other teams, the Cardinals, the Texans, the Panthers now, they have permission to speak with him. Ultimately, what does that mean? They've been given permission. That's great. Good for them. They don't have an interview. The Broncos have an interview, and they get the first crack at him on Tuesday. To me, Cody, this ownership group is proving. They have proven to Sean Payton through an initial conversation, which we know happened, or that was another thing he admitted in that interview with Peter Schrager. He said he's talked to Broncos ownership. It wasn't an official interview. I guarantee you, Cody, that he knows exactly what this meeting is about. And he said to his daughter, she's like, what's the interview process like? Like, do you have a presentation or things? And he chuckled at that. He's like, it's not the same as it was when I interviewed for the Saints or the Packers or other teams. He is a proven head coach. This interview is going to be about, his perspective on the team, dollars and cents. It's going to be a lot of what staff can he put together. It's not going to be about like a 10-year plan for the team. It's going to be, why are you going to come in and make this team a contender? Cody, I think this ownership group is going to hear the things they want to hear from a guy like Sean Payton in this process.
And part of me too, something I heard as well, is that the ownership group is, when they're interviewing some of these candidates, they're really pushing hard and advocating for Ejiro Evero. Right now, obviously, we know Evero has had some head coaching interviews. He's got a couple lined up. But there was an interesting thing that happened over the week, and the Atlanta Falcons submitted a request to interview Ejiro Evero for their defensive coordinator job. And, of course, as expected, the Broncos blocked that from happening. I think Evero's path to becoming a head coach, right? I think there are going to be some teams out there like, first-year head coach. After just being a coordinator, there's hesitancy. Brandon Staley is a great example of that. I think Evero will probably coach maybe 1 or 2 more years as a DC, whether that's in Denver or for another team, before he really gets that opportunity to showcase why he deserves to be a head coach. I still believe he'd be a great head coach in Denver. I think that how the players connect with him is important. They know how to flip the switch, and even Evero knows how to flip the switch. So I think that is something worth noting, because we all know that Sean Payton has said that part of his super staff would be bringing Vic Fangio to Denver as the defense coordinator. Now, will that happen? Is that something that's going to be in control? I don't know. For a guy like George Payton, who had to make the decision of firing Vic Fangio, how does that pose a potential conflict of interest? With the ownership group saying, okay, hey, we want Sean Payton, he wants Vic. Well, here's the reality of the situation. I don't think that Vic Fangio and George Payton ever had a bad relationship. I don't think that's the case at all. I think they had a really good one. Unfortunately, for George Payton, he was a GM in his first year, and it's like, okay, he's not going to fire the coach to bring somebody else in, because the Broncos at the time had no ownership group. So, Sayre, as this whole entire thing forms out this week, it's going to be intriguing. I'm sure we're going to hear different rumors coming out of the woodworks. We'll see if any other jobs open up around the National Football League. But my hope is that Ejiro Evero will stay on staff here in Denver as the defensive coordinator. And Sean Payton, I mean, obviously he'll bring in some other guys, but I think that Denver does have some good coaches on the defensive staff that do deserve some consideration. And I think that we've seen, especially with Nathaniel Hackett, sometimes bringing all your friends to coach with you is not necessarily the best, vantage point to do, and that's something that really came back to bite him in the rear. And luckily, Ejiro Evero is a godsend in a sense for what the Broncos were able to accomplish and achieve this season, despite going 5-12 on the year. But Broncos country, I think everybody else is asking the question: if Sean Payton becomes the head coach, what type of fit will he have with Russell Wilson? Could they have the perfect fit? We'll dive into that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at Ultimate Football GM. And if you've ever wanted to become a general manager of a football team, now you have the opportunity to do just that, all from the palm of your hand with Ultimate Football GM. You get to manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through the season, and lead your team to glory. You're responsible for hiring the right coaches and coordinators, drafting players, signing free agents, and navigating your franchise through the season, not to mention once you get the free agency and the draft. You are in control, all in the palm of your hand. All of this in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline. You can play on the go as you want and when you want to. Locked On Broncos listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code LOCKEDON in all caps in the game store. Once again, promo code Locked On in all caps in the game store, so make sure to check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. As we continue on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platforms, or whether you watch us on YouTube. If you don't make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, here is why you should. Every single day, we have you covered with the latest that's going on in Dove Valley. No clickbait, no false narratives, no hot takes, none of that stuff. We attend practices, games, press conferences, and everything of that nature, obviously with our line of work, Mile High Sports, and you get all that coverage here. We'll always bring an honest perspective, focused from a team-building lens, and we're here for you every single day, all year long, through free agency, the draft, OTAs, training camp, preseason, and the regular season, and hopefully next year, the postseason for Denver. We have you covered every step of the way. Locked On Broncos. Sayre, my friend, let's get to the $1 million question, or as some would say, the $245 million question. There have been people around Sean Payton who have said that he has expressed that he would like to work with Russell Wilson, that he would be excited to work with the Broncos quarterback, as you mentioned earlier, who is 34 coming up into this season. He turned 34 already, but this season he'll play at 34. And I think that there are some things that we have seen, Sayre, this season from Russ. Now, obviously, we can all acknowledge Russell Wilson didn't play his best football. I mean, he played the worst football of his career this year in Denver. However, we saw flashes. We saw glimpses, which tells both you and I, as we've repeated on the show ad nauseum, Russell Wilson still has it in him. And I think the thing that matters the most, and we saw it this weekend with Doug Peterson, with Trevor Lawrence, who threw 4 interceptions in the first half, by the way, and we saw the counter side with Brandon Staley and coaching. Coaching matters. We saw it with Jerry Rosburg, how he inspired the Broncos to compete, and obviously they beat a playoff team, and ironically enough, they beat all the playoff teams so far that have been in there. San Francisco, the Chargers, obviously now eliminated, and Jacksonville. In your opinion, do you feel like Russell Wilson and Sean Payton would be a great fit for one another? Obviously, there's a picture that always goes around social media at the time that he was coaching the Pro Bowl and Russ was the quarterback. I mean, I think so many people have tried to put out the narrative midseason that like Payton wouldn't like a guy like Russ. People I've talked to have said the opposite, that they would actually have a pretty good relationship.
I think that this would be a great relationship, honestly. And I think even if you need a buffer, look, we know the Broncos have interviewed David Shaw, and Jim Harbaugh is not the only one with a connection to David Shaw, right? David Shaw was on way back when you mentioned it in our episode where we talked about him, the Philadelphia Eagles staff with Sean Payton back in the 90s. So these guys know each other. Payton has vouched for David Shaw a number of times, drafted remember he drafted Andrews Pete out of Stanford. I mean, the connections are there. So there could be a buffer there if need be. It doesn't have to be David Shaw either. It could be someone else. But I think these two would get along. Remember, Cody, there's so many fun connections when it comes time for like coaching searches and things like that, and things that you could look at in hindsight, but you try to get ahead of them. You try to like create the trail of breadcrumbs, right? And I think that you look back. Remember when Russell Wilson released his initial list of teams that he wanted to be traded to once upon a time? The New Orleans Saints were on there, along with the Denver Broncos, and I think it was like the Giants or something, Raiders. Yeah, so you look at that list. Sean Payton was the coach of the Saints when that list came out. So I think that definitely there's a desire on Russ's end to work with Sean Payton. You've got to think that Sean Payton would have no issues working with Russell Wilson. Number one, because he's a future Hall of Fame quarterback. Number two, because as a head coach in the NFL, I think a lot of times people get this mistaken, especially when it comes to guys struggling for a season. Do you really think that Sean Payton, is going to think that he can't come in and, put together an offense to make Russ look a lot better? He's an NFL head coach and a very good one at that. I think he's going to be able to do that. Number three, my biggest thing with this whole the Russell Wilson, Sean Payton thing, Cody, there's no necessarily attachment beyond the season, in my opinion. I don't think the Broncos are going to require that of Sean Payton. I don't think his average salary is going to necessitate Russell Wilson being on the team beyond the season. If he stinks, if he's not any good, why would they agree to say, no, you agreed to be here with Russell Wilson? I don't think that's going to be the case. If Russ is not good in 2023, the Broncos can find a way to work around that next year. So to me, I feel like this is a fantastic fit. It's a great opportunity for Russ to get back on his feet. It's a great opportunity for Sean Payton to obviously rake in a ton of cash as an NFL head coach. And I think just for both of these guys to really, work towards something, to compete in a division where there hasn't been much competition lately.
Now, Sean Payton, can we get $1? If that is the case, if you do get the massive payday here, obviously, I think for me as well, right, Sitter, I'm looking forward to seeing whoever the next head coach is as well, because I'll have the chance to get around, interact with them every day when we have media availability, next season, training camp, things like that. I think there are a lot of exciting things on the table, and I think once Denver has kind of their direction set, like, okay, whoever they hire, and maybe it is Payton, maybe it's Harbaugh, maybe it's somebody else that we haven't talked about. Well, I mean, we talked about anybody and everybody at this point. I don't think there's going to be someone that's going to blindside us. They're like, hey, that guy's the head coach. They didn't even that name wasn't even thrown out there. I think that whoever they interviewed, of those candidates, somebody is going to get the job. For me, I think that if Jerry Rosburg can make Russell Wilson, by forcing a game plan to do, what Russ is really well at, to make Russell Wilson look better in 2 weeks, heck, I think that Sean Payton would be a pretty good guy for the job in Denver. And I think that is something, I think in Tuesday's interview, they're going to ask, what is your plan to help the offense score more points? And I'll be intrigued to hear what Sean Payton has to say, but obviously there will be a lot of traction. The Broncos have various interviews set up this week. They'll have Sean Payton on Tuesday, Raheem Morris, and then I believe they close things out with Dan Quinn, rounding out 8 candidates that they believe are the most qualified for the job, and we'll have you covered every step of the way here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. With that said, Broncos country, thank you so much for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Sayre, Bedinger, and myself will be back tomorrow as we continue to talk about the Broncos head coaching search. We'll give you the latest updates on some of the interviews, some of the processes, and we'll also take a look at free agency and some players on this roster who are set to become free agents. You get that and much more on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.